Hi everyone. In this video, we'll take a look at OpenAI's function calling ability. We'll take a look at what purpose it serves, how do you use it, and we'll take a look at some features like parallel function calling, no function calling, and specific function calling. We'll take a look at all of this through an app that we build using a low-code tool, and we'll take a look at the anatomy of this entire capability. Stay tuned. When OpenAI announced function calling, it was a game changer. It allowed OpenAI's LLMs, or large language models, to be able to talk to external services. And you may be thinking this already exists. Yes, it does in a way. Things like Bing on your OpenAI ChatGPT, or things like plugins on your OpenAI ChatGPT, all of these are specific uses of function calling abilities. I will show you how you can do all of that on your own so you can create your own assistant that's capable of doing all this and much more. When ChatGPT came out, one of the biggest gripes that it had was that it didn't really give us up-to-date information. Its training data was limited to September 2021, if I remember it correct. But OpenAI introduced a feature that changed the game on how it can access up-to-date data. It's called function calling ability. What it does is it gives OpenAI the capability to structure requests so that applications can call external services. That may be too confusing at this point, but I'll break it down in step-by-step fashion. Let's first take a look at a demo of what I'm going to show you, an app where I use OpenAI to chat with it, but I also use OpenAI to construct functions that I'm going to run on API services. If you're not familiar with APIs, there's a whole lot of videos about it. I'll link some of my favorites down here. APIs are interfaces that programs can talk to each other. If you're running an application for yourself, you need for your application to be able to talk to GPT-4 and to also be able to talk to some external services. And all of this is done with a blueprint of APIs. Let's take a look at the demo. In the demo, it's very simple. I've constructed an AI assistant. I'm giving it a lot of extra power. I'm allowing it to be able to go fetch some shopping results, go fetch some local results. All of this is coordinated not by my application, but by GPT-4 and my calls to GPT-4. So we'll take a look at the demo and then we'll come back and see the anatomy of what I built and how function calling works. In this example, you can see that I'm trying to find a wireless keyboard, but I want the assistant to give me both online options and local stores. The assistant does a great job, even giving me links to each one. In this example, I'm trying to do the same code base, but I'm trying to find some gift ideas and also some restaurant examples. Assistant again understands what I am asking for and does a parallel function calling to give me the results. In the same code base, we're now having a conversation with the assistant and helping it find some golf clubs for my brother and also some golf courses nearby. The assistant does a good job of organizing all of this in two different columns and allows me to link out to either buying the golf item or to call the golf course. So there you have it. You've looked at the demo, and now let's kind of dive deep into how the demo was constructed. Let's take a look at function calling and what it is and how does that work. Oh, by the way, we're actually filming in one of our friends' startup space, so some of these in the background may look kind of new to y'all. Let's take a look at what function calling really is. Function calling is nothing but OpenAI's ability to structure output. That's all it is. There's stuff around JSON calling right now. Function calling is actually what started out in that space. So let's break down function calling. I've given it steps so we can kind of run through the steps. Function calling is available both in the Assistants API and the Chat Completions API. In this example, we'll take a look at the Assistants API, but it's the same concept even in the Chat Completions API. In this example, all I'm trying to do is I want to interact with GPT. I want to give my assistant a name of a company. I wanted to take a look at some of the news articles out there, and I wanted to see how those news articles affected its stock price. In order to facilitate this, we need two important external services whose data is paramount to this request. Remember, ChatGPT is trained on data that's pre-existing, so it may not have the current stock price in its current data set. So in order to get that, we're going to hit two services. One is the stock price API, and the other one is news API. News API to get the articles, stock price API to get the stock price. And what we're doing in step 0, very important, is to understand what is the API need in each of these API services. In the stock price API service, it needs a stock symbol, it needs a start date and an end date, so it can give you the price for each of those dates. And for news API service, it needs the same thing. It needs the subject, which is name of the company in this example. It needs an article start date and article's end date, so it can fetch all the relevant articles. And this is the one that's most important, is you have to structure this ask from each of these API services into a schema that's familiar to OpenAI. It is the OpenAPI 3 schema. It's a JSON format schema. It is the standard format for API calls everywhere. You should be able to see this as an example here, but you should also be able to see this as an example in the website. Once you actually take these API services and structure them in that OpenAPI JSON format, you have to feed that as tools into the assistant or into the chat completion. And the reason you give that is so when ChatGPT runs your messages, it knows what is the output it needs to output to facilitate your application to be able to call these functions. That's all function calling. It's not actually calling the function from the OpenAI servers. It is giving you an output that you can take and call from your application. Step 0, you're going to be putting them in the format that's readable to OpenAI. And you're going to be putting that in this case, we're putting it under an assistant. In the assistant, seen the assistants API, I've linked my video below. There are functions, code interpreter, and web browser. This is the functions part of the assistants API. So you give those two functions, you declare them. You give a little bit of instructions on how to call them. So for example, this function is called fetch news articles. The other one is called get stock prices. Make sure you give instructions to say, when I give you a subject and you see the dates, structure it in a particular form. That was step 0. So we haven't even gotten started yet. So step 1 of the whole situation is you interacting with the agent. You are giving the agent, you're talking to the agent, you're asking it what agent is saying that I can try to understand how the news is, so to see what's affecting stock price. So you say, can you help me find how the news for the last 5 days is affecting the Amazon stock price? So natural language, LLMs are able to understand that that means that the user wants Amazon stock price for the last 5 days, and we need to go check the news articles. Step 2 is the assistant will process it, and this is all done through GPT-4, and it will give the formatted output in such a way that it's readable to the API services. That's all it does. It doesn't reach back into the external services. So that was step 3. Step 4, it sends those formatted structured outputs to our application, and it'll send them in a waiting state. And the reason it's waiting is it wants you to run them and let ChatGPT or GPT-4 know the success or failure or data of those API calls. It's going into a waiting state. Then the application backend is running those APIs. The way it runs those APIs is it calls using those functions that ChatGPT or GPT-4 has returned. It calls the news API service and the stock API service. So that's step 5 and 6. And once it gets either a success or data from those API services, it submits a response. It submits a response to the tools endpoint to let it know that it's either succeeded, failed, or it passes the data that it's gathered. In this situation, let's assume we pass the data that it's gathered, and the tools endpoint will then process it with the assistant and the OpenAI API and pass it back to us as a message that tells us, hey, based on my analysis, there was news articles talking about some shipping blockades, so that has been causing your Amazon stock to go down. Again, totally fictional scenario. I have no idea if that really happened. I just wanted to give you an example. So that, in a nutshell, is how function calling works. So this is the whole structure of function calling. Once you know this, you know everything about function calling. Now, there are different variations of function calling. There's parallel function calling. There's no function calling, specific function calling. I'll walk through all of them with some examples. Now, if you remember my example and my demo that I showed you, we had a couple of things going on. We had a local search from Google, and we also had a shopping search from Google. Now, I'll explain to you the concepts of parallel function calling, no function calling, and specific function calling using that example. We've taken the exact same anatomy of the function calling that we've learned and put it over here. So in this is specific to our example. We have SERP API. SERP API is a great place to find different APIs. I'll walk them through in the demo when we are getting to the code piece of it. But it's a good place for us to get multiple API calls. So we're using SERP APIs, Google Shopping API, and Google Local API. We're formatting them with the specific schema that we've kind of understood that OpenAI needs. We're putting those as two functions, get local, get Google Local, and get Google Shopping results. In our instructions, we're telling it, hey, when you have situations where you can use both the functions, use them parallelly. Let's go through our process 1 to 7 again, and that'll help us understand the process again. Step 0 was actually converting those schemas. Step 1, I am talking to the assistant. I'm asking it, hey, I want to surprise my wife for her birthday. Can you help me pick out a gift and show you some restaurants? I told the assistant that I want to buy a running shoe and that I'm looking for some Indian spots and I live in Detroit, Michigan. So step 1, it goes to the assistant. It figures out the tools endpoint that it can do a parallel call. And this is very important, that because I've given it both sets of information, it's able to do the parallel call. And now we'll walk through how we can do that in our playground, but just assume parallel call is nothing but two of these functions can be returned at the same time. I'll pause there just to explain what specific function calling is. So let's say I've given it that message, but I really don't want it to look for the shoe yet. I want to be working through the Indian spots in Detroit first. So if I'm to do that, in my call that I sent to assistant in number 1, I would specifically mention get Google Local in the tools section. So then it knows that I have to only work on one function and I don't have to do on both. I can also send tools equal to none, which will tell me don't use any of the functions. All these function calls are put under the tools section of your API calls. Same process like we saw before. 1 goes over, 2, it structures these functions with the information that it has. 3, it sends a weighting information to my application backend. I'm using Flutterflow for my app that I've developed. It is a good front-end, back-end kind of a low-code tool. I'm using that to send information to my SERP API. SERP API returns to me the API call. I either give the results of the API call to my tools endpoint, or I send it, hey, these were successful. So in my case, I just sent it, these were successful, and I displayed them outside of OpenAI. So I want us to get familiarized with this screen right here, because we'll be jumping into it in our code demo. This is nothing but the playground UI that OpenAI gives you. It allows you to play with all of the API assistants, etc. that you're setting up. I have 2 functions that I've given. And when I give the message, it triggers both at the same time. So this is parallel function calling, and it gives it waiting for me to input either, I can either give it output or just give it success true. But as you can see, it's able to discern from everything that I have, where I live, what in what kind of cuisine that I need for my local. It's also able to discern the specific categories from my single text. And that is where the power of LLMs come into picture, because they allow you to build very low and lightweight backends because they can do the heavy lifting. You don't need to do a Python call or a Flutter call that takes into account what people have given, categorizes everything that they've put in, and kind of figured out what you want them to call. You can let OpenAI do all of that for you. And that's the reason these are a game changer when it comes to assistance APIs. This is the run status that goes on standby. So it needs to be released from standby by giving answer to all of the details around function calling, what models are used for function calling, what are returned. Everything is available on the OpenAI's website. Most importantly, you have how to do function calling for chat completions and how to do function calling for assistance API. So this is the same interface that I just explained to you. If you can take a look at it, I'm giving some instructions to this function calling. I'm also giving it some functions, and I am going to run it. So let's do a cancel run, clear, and let's set up a new run. All right, so I am going to be giving it this instruction. I'm assuming because I've given it both, it's going to invoke both. And that's what I wanted us to see, is like how OpenAI knows and figures out what to do. Tool calls requires action. So requires action means that it is on standby and it needs you to go get your application to run these APIs and give the result back. So let's assume I've run them and I'm giving it, and then I've given it instruction on proceeding forward, and it says, there you go. And it displays it outside of my thing. So again, I will paste the instruction that I've used here, but it's a good instruction that I had to get to with some trial and error. How I built the app. A quick plug here. I've been using Flutterflow for a lot of quick demos and stuff. It's a great low-code tool to do your UI and your backend at the same time. I'll walk through how I built this app, but there are lots more Flutterflow channels out there that do excellent work in covering how to use Flutterflow in a more exhaustive fashion. In this situation, I will just cover how I used it, and I'll put the code in there, and I'll make my project available for people to clone. Example, we are submitting our instructions, and then it's going through those 1 to 7 steps. So let's take a look if we can actually figure out what those 1 to 7 steps are in our code. Let's just take a look at the action we're doing and how we're calling APIs and stuff. It's very important when you're using OpenAI to use the latest APIs. In Flutterflow, the good thing is you can actually upload the entire Swagger file. So in this situation, there's a OpenAI Swagger file in OpenAI's GitHub. I'll put a link to it below. You can grab all of that and pull all of their latest API calls. That'll make sure that you're not making a mistake. Then we have some other API calls. We have SERP API, and SERP API, as I mentioned, is a great tool that allows us to use multiple services. So you can see all these services are available as API calls. So once you are able to select what you want and do, you can figure out how the API kind of runs across the page. Different objects have different needs. Different objects have different JSON tags. You can kind of get them and use them across in your application. So in our Flutterflow, we got our OpenAI calls and we got our SERP calls. So all of this is available as API calls. We'll call them in our action. If you go back to our page, so this is a representation of our 1 to 8 steps. Now let me walk through very quickly how they go forward. So every time you send a message, you call the first call, that is the create thread. So it creates a thread, then it populates a message, then you pull the message, you display it on your screen, and then you go to the next steps, which are create a run. You have to create a run. And when you create a run, it's very important that here is where you can actually give tools, none, tools, function one, function two. You can specifically call them specific to their functions. So once you've called your create run, then you would have to check for the run status. So this is where your run status is checked. So it's checking to see if the run status is complete or not. So up until here, we're still in step 2 of the whole situation. So once it is running and then it goes into standby, that is the moment it is able to give us the functions. So once it is able to go into the run status of requires action, it is able to go into the situation where it is able to send us the function calls for the API calls. And once you have that in requires action, you're able to take the variables that the run status has returned, and you're able to plug it into the SERP apps, the 2 SERP API apps that we have, the shop app and the local app. Once you have information or results out of those 2 API calls, you're then able to go to our tools and you're submitting to the tool. So this is the call that you have to submit to the tool. So submit tool outputs to run. So this is the standby clearance. So once you've cleared the standby, then you're all set. You can just pull your latest message, and that will be the message that has the information where OpenAI has gone through your API information and figured out and given you the analysis you need. So friends, that is in a nutshell the function calling ability of OpenAI. Important takeaways from this are function calling is a very powerful tool to get structured output out of OpenAI. It does not mean that OpenAI can call external services. You still have to handle that on your application side, which requires authentication, etc., and so on and so forth. The other big takeaway is that function calling opens up OpenAI's capability to be an AI agent more effectively. And I believe that function calling, along with the Assistants API, is laying out the blueprint for a true AI agent platform that will allow users to actually have an AI experience where automation is key. If you've liked the content, please feel free to subscribe. The Medium article, which goes along with the video, has all of these details in good detail and has the links to the code, etc. Please feel free to drop a comment for any questions. I will try to answer them as much as